I'd been thinking for a while about what I was going to talk about tonight. And because my main focus with writing instruments is history, evolution, development, the golden age of fountain pens from the late 1800s all the way up till post-World War II, so about 1950, 1960. And as I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today, it suddenly occurred to me that in the grand scheme of everything in life, the basic construct of a pen that carries its own ink supply, whether that's a fountain pen, a roller ball, a ballpoint, felt tip, whatever, is actually an incredibly recent development when you consider the history of writing going back thousands and tens of thousands of years. And so originally I was just going to talk about early fountain pens, but then I thought that's not going to be engaging enough. So what I did was I thought I'll expand it a bit, and I will talk about tonight the transition between what it was like before we had pens that had their own ink supplies, what it was like afterwards, and what changed along the way. So we had originally reed pens, we had quill pens, we had brush pens, all made of natural materials, made of bird feathers, the flight feathers of large birds, geese, duck, anything that was suitably sized. We had brushes made from animal bristles, and we had reeds taken from, just rushes growing along riverbanks. And preparing these writing instruments was a lot of work. I don't know how many people here know how many steps go into making a quill pen. It's a lot of steps. To make a quill pen, first you have to find a feather of the right size. You have to find the bird. You have to eat the bird. You have to get the feathers. You have to find one that's the right size. You have to dry out the feather. Traditionally, this is done by filling the feather with really hot sand or burying it in sand, drying it all out. Then once it's dry, you take it out, you shake out all the sand. You have your pen knife. That's what these are. These are pen knives. So you would have, that's where the name comes from, because they are knives to cut pens. So it's a pen knife. No. I mean, you can try, but I don't think it'll work. So that's what that's what the small blade here is for. That's not a knife. So they would use the small blade to trim the end of the feather. And it's a lot of cuts. It's about 6 cuts to make a writing point. And once you've done that, and you've shaped the very tip to whatever writing style you want, then you can write with it. But only after you've taken the large blade of your penknife and you've cut off all the barbs, all the fuzzy frilly bits at the end of the quill, because they just get in the way. So you cut them all off and you leave a little, a plume at the end for decoration. And you would write with that until it gets too soft to write with. Then you have to sharpen it again, you have to cut a new tip. And you'd keep going until the pen is too short to hold. And that was how it was done for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Still is?
Yep, still is. Even today. Yep. And so the very word pen comes from penna, the Latin word for feather. And for a long time, that was how it was done. And the problem was, this was, as I said, it's a lot of work to make one quill. And so in the 1700s, early 1800s, they started to look for alternatives that were cheaper, that were faster, that were longer lasting. And they started to make metal pens. Now, pen points made of metal go back actually just as long. They go back hundreds and hundreds of years. But the problem is the pen points were all handmade. They were all made by jewelers and goldsmiths and silversmiths. So one little pen point would cost, the same as a gold ring. And obviously you can't mass produce that for everyone. And it's around this time that the whole idea of what a pen is starts to change. So earlier, a pen is defined by what it's made of. It's a brush pen, it's a reed pen, it's a quill pen. Then in the 1700s and the very early 1800s, when they started experimenting with replaceable, longer lasting metal points, well, they thought, well, what do we call these? Today you would call it a nib. But back then, they still called them pens. Because to those people, the pen is what you physically write with. The quill pen is so called because that's what you write with. So when they started making them out of metal, it was just a quill pen, a reed pen, a metal pen. And over here, I brought along a whole heap of 19th century steel pens. So when you went shopping, when you went to your stationer's shop, you didn't buy a box of nibs. You bought a box of pens. So you can pass them around. But the thing about this is, when they started making them at the turn of the 19th century, they were still all handmade, and it wasn't until 1822 that a Mr. Mitchell, living in Birmingham, in England, figured out how to make cheap, mass-produced steel pens. So cheap that you can fill up a whole box and sell it for 6p at the shop. And the big problem that they had was these pens, they rust really easily. And the problem is, to make them cheap enough to be mass-produced, you have to use the cheapest materials you can find. So to make them last longer, all these steel pens had to be coated. So if you open the boxes, they're all heat treated. So they're all blued, they're all heat blued to stop them from rusting, or they're all plated in nickel to stop them from rusting. But this took time to take off. It takes time to manufacture 1 million steel pens. So while this is taking off, people are still using quills. They're still cutting them by hand like their grandparents and their great-grandparents did 200 years before. back in the 17th century. And so, as a result, and I just want to thank Pam for letting me borrow this. I promise I won't do that. So, in the interim, while steel pens were still getting off the ground, they had little contraptions like this. This is sterling silver, and it's a quill holder. Instead of having the entire feather shaft, you would cut your quill, you would slice off the point, so the first maybe ½ an inch, stick it in this like you would do with a throwaway steel pen, and you would write with this. And then when this wears out, you'd cut another quill point, slice it off and stick it in, and you'd continue until you used up the whole feather.
I would contradict you a little bit. You would buy a box of quills.
Yes.
A box of ready
Yeah.
cut.
I have seen those too, actually.
Yes,
I saw it. You had a box of them at one of the. Yes.
I don't think many people cut their own quills to go in these holders. I think you went to a station and bought a box of
Yeah.
ready cut quills, according to Brandis papers.
Just the money to buy that.
Yeah.
The quills.
Does this make a pen more portable than having an actual quill?
Oh, I
Does it
think
have a cap?
because actual writing compendiums from the 16th, 17th, 18th century, which maybe only this long, and the quills in them didn't have the feathery end on them,
Yeah. You cut them all off.
and they were just
Yeah. Just a stick, just a barb. Yeah.
yeah. But people who've been writing with quill pens were used to the lovely feel of So the steel pens felt stiff and scratchy.
Yep.
And then people were still feel
Yep.
feel dead.
That was actually one of the complaints about the early steel pens, was that they were really sharp and they were really scratchy. I've read old advertisements, from the Birmingham pen manufacturers, and they would advertise their pens saying that they were the smoothest pens. They wouldn't catch the paper, they wouldn't rip anything. And so by the middle of the 1800s, you start getting these things. Now, I will recall you back to the terminology. A pen is what you hold to write with using ink. A pen in the 1800s is this thing. This is the pen. This is the pen holder. That's what they were called. These days, people will pick these up, at the pen show or whatever, or you'll see them on eBay or whatever, and they'll call them dip pens. Nobody in the Victorian era ever called this dip pen. They called them a pen holder. Because the pen is a thing that you stick into the holder. So this one is sterling silver. And this one is ivory. And so for the next 70 or 80 years, that was considered the high point of writing technology. You could have pen holders made of almost anything. I've seen them made of mother of pearl, ivory, bone, sterling silver. I've even seen one made of 15-karat gold. And yep. And so, for the next 50 or 60 years, that was the high point of writing technology.
By the way, this
Yep.
little box, anybody knows it, ball-pointed pens.
Yep. ball pointed because it was smoother than the sharp pointed ones that would scratch on your desk.
Do you know if the ball pointed ones had a tip made of different stuff, or was it?
No, it was simply a shape. It would have been how the tip of the pen was stamped and cut when it was made. Because these were all, how these steel pens were made is they were punched in a punch press. So you would have this, a steel press, you have a really thin sheet of steel, and you'd have the press on top with the shape of the pen set into the underside of the press, and it would just punch out over and over and over again. There would be steam-powered presses, and they'd punch them out in their thousands. And that was the only way they could make them cheap enough to fill up a whole box like this. And so, again, we go back to the terminology. In the second half of the 1800s, in fact, for a long time, people have been trying to invent a pen of any kind that doesn't need constant dipping. Because back then, if you had to do writing of any kind, you needed this. You needed an inkwell. This one is sterling silver. And it's got all these little holes around it. This is where you put your quills or your dip pens when you're not using them. And inkwells, like anything else, came in a whole variety of materials. You had simple ones made of wood, made of brass. You have that one made of silver. It's from 1896, I think that one is. Yes. The primary school desk ones were little porcelain ones. And for those of us who may be old enough to remember, or who had parents who were old enough to remember, when you were in school, the teacher would elect a student to be the ink monitor and walk around and fill up everyone's little inkwell. And they used to sell gigantic bottles of ink, 1 liter or more, and they would put these in the classroom, in the supplies closet, and when it was time at the end of the week or whatever, they would entrust a little boy or girl with a massive glass bottle of ink, carry it around and fill up everyone's inkwells. Yes? Yep. Yes, they did. And so, as I said, they were using dip pens with cheap steel nibs, and back in the Victorian era, people were extremely frugal. They did anything they could to save money. Even to the extent of buying something like this. Does anyone know what this is? Yes. It's a pen wiper or a pen brush. They're almost extinct today. You won't find them for sale anywhere. Yeah. And what used to happen was, if you read old magazines, old journals from the Victorian era, they used to have, little arts and crafts sections. And in the arts and crafts pages, they would have little projects for school children. And they would say, you can make mummy and daddy their very own pen wipers. And all you would need is leftover felt or leftover cotton, an old shirt or whatever, and you cut out nice little circles, sew them together, put something decorative on top as a weight, and you can take it home and put it on Daddy's desk. Or if you didn't want something homemade, you went out and you bought this. So that's a simple brush on the end, and what you would do is, after every use of your pen, after you finish writing it, to stop the steel pen point from rusting, you would wipe it off or poke it through the brush to clean off all the ink.
Would that be enough for it not to corrode?
It would slow it down. The only way to really stop it would be like wash it in water and then wipe it down completely dry. But if you couldn't be bothered doing that, and to be honest, most people wouldn't bother, wiping the excess ink off was just one way to slow down the rusting. And I mean, the rusting was a real problem. And so in the late 19th century, all kinds of minds started thinking about how they can fix this problem of always needing an inkwell, of always needing a spare box of pens, of always needing to carry one of these around every time you go traveling. Yes. An old Victorian writing slope. And so,
I'm glad you cherish it.
yes,
To be very gentle with it.
don't worry, my big one's at home. So,
I sadly tell you right now, they used to build them really well back then.
Yeah.
They don't do that now. That's quite charmant.
these would have their own inkwells in them, made of glass with brass caps that you screw on. They would have little lift-up pen trays. They would have blotting paper tucked in. And this is the Victorian equivalent of your modern laptop computer. In here, you would store all your correspondence, your documents, your envelopes, sealing wax, seals, spare pen pens. Charge life is infinite, which is why these lasted for so long. But then, in the late 1800s, when all these brilliant minds were thinking about how to get rid of these cheap steel pens, they came up, one man, Lewis Edson Waterman, in 1884. He came up with the one thing, the one invention that finally made the self-contained writing instrument possible. So, Dragan mentioned this earlier, in that people had been trying to make a self-contained writing instrument for a very long time, literally hundreds and hundreds of years. But they could never get it to work because they couldn't master the one thing, which was ink flow. You could fill up the pen, you could empty the pen, but you couldn't get it to release a reliable, consistent flow of ink onto the page. And that was because nobody had figured out that to get it to work, you need capillary action and you need air pressure. The only way that the ink inside the pen runs down to the nib onto the page is through air pressure. If the air pressure isn't equal, the ink won't flow. And in 1884, Lewis Waterman invented a tiny little piece of ebonite about this big, which was the 3-channel fountain pen feed. The 3-channel feed was the one thing they needed to make the pen work. Because as ink flowed down one channel, the other 2 channels could draw in air to balance the pressure to make the pen write. But, let me think, where is it? Not all manufacturers had figured this out. Because remember, in the 1800s, there were a lot of people thinking about this. And so, for those who couldn't figure it out, who hadn't struck upon that yet, they were trying literally anything to get this to work. And in the late 1800s, there was a lot of litigation. People guarded their patents very, very jealously. All you have to do is to read about the history of sewing machines to see how jealously they guarded their patents. In fact, one of the reasons why the sewing machine took so long to be invented is because all the various inventors spent more time suing each other than inventing the sewing machine. I'm not even making that up. They spent more time. They would drag each other to court over and over and over again because they were all stealing each other's patents. And it was only when they agreed to pool them that they could make a successful sewing machine. And so when they were inventing the fountain pen, the same thing happened. They had all these inventors with all these ideas, but because they all guarded them so jealously, it took them forever to actually create a pen that worked. And so as a result, you end up with stuff like this. So this is a Swan eyedropper fountain pen from the 1890s. And it has a feature on it that you will not see on any modern fountain pen. It has 2 feeds. It has an overfeed and an underfeed. And the reason for that is because, as I said, they hadn't figured out that you need equal air pressure to get the pen to work. They hadn't figured out capillary action yet. So to compensate for the fact that early feeds were terrible at delivering ink, they said, well, if one feed isn't good enough, we'll just have 2 of them. And so you end up with something like this. Oh, by the way, all these pens have ink in them, so if you want to scribble them with them, you can go ahead. Yeah, of course we do, yeah. And so, the development of the fountain pen began. And again, we go back to the terminology. Because, remember, no one had ever invented something like this before, no one had ever owned something like this before, so they had no idea what to call it. So if you read old documentation from the 1870s, 1880s, if you go to like old patent documents and stuff, you'll find these things being called all kinds of things. They weren't called fountain pens, they were self-filling pens, they were reservoir pens, they were all these other terms until about late 1880s, early 1890s, they finally settled on the idea that it will be called a fountain pen. Because early pens all used wells. You have to draw the ink from the well. A fountain is self-supplying. So since they wanted a pen that supplies its own ink, instead of drawing it out of the well over and over again, they call it a fountain pen. And so in the 1890s, early 1900s, they started manufacturing pens like this. This is from 1904. This is a Waterman Ideal. And it's typical of the types of fountain pens that were being developed at the very turn of the century. So this has the patented 3-channel feed. This has 1 feed. And it is still almost unlike anything you'll see today. There's no clip, there's no cap band, there's no self-filling mechanism, it's all eyedropper. So you would buy a pen like this, and let me see if I have it. It would come in a box like this. Again, this is from the early 1900s. And you have to remember, up to this point, people had only ever used dip pens of some variety. The whole idea of a pen that carries its own ink was so alien to literally everyone that when you bought your new Waterman Ideal and it came in this beautiful blue box, there is a warning on the inside. Do not take the gold nib out of the holder. Because what used to happen was that, because everyone was used to using steel pens, when the nib doesn't write, when it's dented, when it's twisted, when it's dirty, 50, 60 years of practiced use told you, get a handkerchief, wrap it around, rip it out, open your box, get a new one, shove it in. They've been doing that for generations. So when you have your new reservoir fountain pen, they had to warn everyone in block capitals.
Is that the same time as the payment with gold nibs?
Yeah. They had to warn everyone that the writing point in your new reservoir pen is there for life. You're not supposed to yank it out. And because people were just so used to doing that.
You hear that, Mark? Don't tamper with it.
I reckon I'm going to make a right.
It's got ink in it, you can find out. And so, as writing became more and more accessible, you have more and more accessories to go along with it. There was a much greater emphasis, there was a much greater knowledge, appreciation of things that most people today don't care about, like paper weight, for example, the density of paper. And so these days, most paper is really thin, it's quite flimsy, but back in the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s even, paper was a lot thicker and a lot denser. So when you were writing, if you made a mistake with your dip pen or your fountain pen and you wanted to correct it, there was no whiteout in those days. Whiteout doesn't come up until the 1950s, 1960s.
They scratched it up. And they,
Yep. They used one of these.
yeah.
This is an ink eraser knife or an ink scraper. This is really sharp, I know, because I sharpened it myself. And in the Victorian era, in the early 1900s, when paper was a lot thicker and a lot denser than what it is today, if you made a mistake and you couldn't just scrap it and rewrite the whole thing, you would take this, you'd hold it like this, and you would very, very gently scrape it back and forth, and that would slowly shave off the top layer of paper fibers. So once it was clean and clear, you could write the correct word or the correct letter underneath.
Was the
very little bleed, then was it nothing?
The paper was really dense, so it didn't bleed or feather through.
I mean, that practice continued in the 1990s.
Yep.
Engineering drawing office.
Yes, because they needed high quality paper. Yep.
And you needed to be able to photocopy through it.
Yes. Yep.
So they scraped the
Yep.
ink off,
Yes.
did their work again, and then
Yep.
went off to print.
And so,
Hey?
Good old road trip.
Road through, yeah, that's good. I've got it all right.
hmm?
Now,
Yes. Yeah.
hey?
And so, they used to use these to clean off all the ink, and then once they'd removed all the fibers, they would rewrite the correct letter or word underneath. And this particular one is made of ivory, and it's manufactured by the Sheffield firm of Joseph Rogers and Company. If anyone here collects pocket knives, razors, Joseph Rogers was the official cutlery manufacturer to the royal family for a very long time, about almost 200 years. And yeah, they held the royal warrant as cutlers to Queen Victoria, to her son, King Edward, and even up to George V. And so, up until this point, all fountain pens were eyedropper fillers. Every little box came with one of these, little eyedropper. I assume you've all seen one of these, so I won't pass it around. But as writing increased, as more people were writing because pens were more accessible, they needed a way to control the bleeding and the feathering. Now, in the 1700s, 1800s, even back in the 1600s, what they used, and unfortunately I don't have one with me because they're quite hard to find these days, but what they used to use is a little container called a pounce pot. Has anyone heard of a pounce pot? Pounce pot. Yeah. Pounce pot is like a little shaker, like a pepper shaker, and inside would be extremely fine powder. It would be powdered sand, it would be crushed shell, something like that. Hummus, yep. Cuttlefish, yep. And it was ground up until it was really fine, and they called it pounce. So pounce is what you keep in your pounce pot, and you keep that on your desk. And once you'd finish writing, you take your pounce pot, you shake it over the paper, and it acts like talcum powder. It absorbs all the liquid, dries the ink, and then when you were done, you pick up the paper, you would funnel the used pounce back into the pounce pot. In fact, if you go on like eBay, you will find a lot of antique shakers which are sold as pounce pots. But a real pounce pot has a very specific shape. And that shape is that it has to have a concave top. The reason for the concave top is because you recycle the sand over and over again. So, once you've finished writing, you've shaken the sand over it, you pick up the paper and you pour it back into the pounce pot. And the shape of the lid is there specifically to funnel the sand back in. So if it doesn't have that shape, you can't do it. But in the 1800s, they started making blotting paper. So most people would have had, if you were well equipped, you would have a desk blotter with the little tabs with blotting paper on it. Or you would have a rocker blotter with the curved base and the flat rectangular top, maybe with a handle on it, which you would screw down to hold the paper together. Or, if you're really pressed for space and you can't even have a rocker blotter on your desk, you'll have one of these. These are roller blotters. So again, these are from the late 1800s. They are handled in sterling silver. This is a small one, this is a big one. And so you would wrap your cutout of blotting paper around it. You would hold it down with a dabble of glue, fold it down, make sure it doesn't slide off. And just like a rocker blotter, you just roll it across, you keep using it until the paper is so saturated with ink that you can't use it anymore. So you tear off the paper and you resurface it again with fresh paper. So, as fountain pens started becoming more popular, they needed a way to fill them up without the eyedropper. No, there's no screw caps. So, they started coming up with stuff like this. This is a very famous model from about 1910. And this is the Conklin crescent filler. And this was probably the first fountain pen, one, to have its own filling mechanism, and two, to have a celebrity endorsement. Yes, Mark Twain, or Samuel Clemens, was the first celebrity to endorse a fountain pen, this fountain pen. And in the advertising material, they said, "Mr. Twain, will you give us a quote about your feelings about the Conklin crescent filling fountain pen?" And he said, "Yes, it is a savor of profanity because the crescent stops the pen from rolling off the desk. Because it would roll off the desk, it would land on the floor, and then he'd have to get down on his knees and crawl around under his desk to find it. Or stand on it. Sorry? I am not sure the specific model. So, in the early 1900s, the basic look or shape of the fountain pen still hadn't been decided on. Sorry? Yeah, sure, go ahead. Yeah. And so, in the early 1900s, the form of the fountain pen still hadn't been decided on. So, when you went out to your stationery shop or your pen shop to buy a pen, there was no set look for what it could be. It could be a crescent filler. It might or might not have a cap band. It might or might not have a clip. And so, in the early 1900s, your pen looked like this. It's very simple, it's very plain. It's made of ebonite, or black hard rubber. And it was like, it's like that old joke about Model T Fords. Your pen can be any color you want, so long as it's black. And so to differentiate their pens in any way whatsoever, manufacturers would put chasing onto them. They would have metal rollers that would heat the rubber and impress a decoration around the cap and the barrel and roll it on by machine. But as I said, they were very plain. So to decorate their pens to make them more individual, what you might do is you would buy your pen and you would take it to your local jeweler and you would tell him, cover it in gold. So you would end up with something like this, with a 9-carat gold band around it. And these were called signature bands because it's where you can get your jeweler to engrave your name, your initials, date of birth, birthday, Christmas, whatever, or your signature. It was a way to make your pen stand out. And this was a very common practice. Here's another one. Again, so here we've got the owner's initials on it. But as I said, the form of the fountain pen hadn't been decided on yet. So early fountain pens, all the pens I've passed around, none of them have pocket clips because the pocket clip wasn't an established part of the pen yet. So if you wanted a clip, you went to your stationer or your pen seller and you say, I want a clip. They say, all right, yeah, we've got a box of them here. Which one do you want? And you'd buy one for a couple of cents. And they were called accommodation clips, which is what this is here. So this simply slides off like that. They're completely removable. So when you bought this pen originally, it would just look like this. There's nothing on it. You'd buy the clip separately. You would marry the two together. And that was your pen. And again, this one has the gold bands around it to make it stand out. And like the others, this is 9-carat gold. And that's another thing. Early fountain pens didn't have any decorative bands or rings around the caps. Because like I said, no one knew they would need them. And this is how it started to change, because people realized that it might be a good idea to have a ring around the edge of the cap to stop cracking. Because what used to happen was people would put their pen caps on or screw them on, and they would be too forceful or too vigorous, and ebonite would just snap, crumble. So it's around this time that ink started changing as well. With fountain pens, you can't have, powdered inks. So you would use a new formulation of ink, which had no particulates in it, so that it wouldn't dry, it wouldn't settle, it wouldn't clog your precious 3-channel feed, or your Lucky Curve feed, or your Christmas tree feed, or your spoon feed. And you bought bottles like this. Now this, I've never seen another one like this. Most modern bottles of fountain pen ink are about 50 or 60 ml. This is, no, this is a Waterman. This is 5 fluid ounces, which in modern measurements is almost 150 ml. It's about 140 47, 48 mil in here. So, as I said, early pens were all very bland. They were all black. You like it, Desi?
It seems so unnatural, like he thinks that'll hit students.
What makes that?
Oh. Don't drop it, Des. So, to make their pens stand out from the regular black, chased, hard rubber pens, manufacturers would do almost anything. They would mix red and black hard rubber together to get a wood grain effect. Or another thing that was really common was that they would do overlays. They would do overlays in mother of pearl, or if money was no object, they would do it in solid gold. So these two pens are from about 1910, 1915, and they're both overlaid in solid gold. This one is hallmarked for 1912 and is 9-carat gold. This one is hallmarked for 18-carat gold. And they would have been custom pieces. You would have asked your jeweler to sheath your pen in gold, or if you were really lucky, the manufacturer themselves would do it and sell it as a luxury item. So for example, if you take a closer look at the Waterman, it actually has on the bottom of the cap, Waterman's Ideal pressed into the gold. And that's still something that's done today. So you can still go out and buy pens which are solid silver, solid gold. A lot of companies still make them. This one is Mont Blanc from the 1980s, 1990s. I bought this during COVID lockdown. I had nothing else to do, so saved up all my pennies to get me something special. And so, as pens started to become more common, manufacturers started looking for ways to draw in the public. They started making them out of different materials. They started making them out of celluloid, starting in the mid-1920s. And they started to focus less on the pen and more on how you can market it. And so they came up with this crazy idea in the 1920s and the 1930s of introducing something called a lifetime guarantee. The notorious lifetime guarantee. Yes.
I think there's nothing wrong with this.
There's something wrong with that one. I'll have to take it home and have a look. So, in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, they started introducing this idea of the lifetime guarantee. And the lifetime guarantee was that whatever pen you bought from whatever manufacturer would be guaranteed for the life of the owner. And if there were any faults with the pen, if it was damaged in any way, you could send it back to the manufacturer and they would repair it for free. And so a lot of companies bought into this. The two most famous ones are Schaefer with the white dots logo and Parker with the blue diamond. And what happened was, in the late 1940s, I think it was like 1948, Parker was actually taken to court. And the court ruled that Parker and other pen companies could not have lifetime warranties because it was too open to fraud and misuse, and it could be too easily misinterpreted and taken advantage of. And so they told companies like Parker, Schaefer, Waterman, you can't have lifetime warranties. So as a result, the famous Parker Blue Diamond disappeared. Schaefer held on to its famous white dot by lying through their teeth and telling the courts that the white dot isn't actually a guarantee of a lifetime warranty. It's our new corporate logo. That's all it is. And they had to stick to that or surrender the white dot trademark. And so this is when fountain pens enter their golden age, the first half of the 20th century. And it's when the fountain pen really establishes itself. It's no longer just a curiosity, it's no longer a thought experiment, it's no longer something that people need to think about what it looks like, how it's supposed to function, what features it's supposed to have. And for the first time, a generation of people could grow up not having to use an inkwell or a dip pen and a box of steel pens. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much.